Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a new releases wrap-up specifically for some new fantasy books, and the books that I'll be talking about would be Ruination, Belladonna, The Dragon's Promise, The Ballad of Never After, and The Notorious Sorcerer. And I'll have timestamps down below, so if you'd like to skip to any one particular book, you can do so at your convenience. And I'll also have purchase links in case any of these sound interesting. You can check them out there. I will have an in-depth book review for Ruination coming up soon, and then I have already done an in-depth book review for Belladonna. So if your interest is piqued after hearing about either of those, once the video for Ruination is up, I'll have it linked, and then I'll have the in-depth review for Belladonna linked as well. Jumping into it, I'm actually going to start with Notorious Sorcerer, as this was a DNF. I did not end up completing this one. I read about a third of it, and I still wanted to mention it though because one, I think that the premise is still really interesting, and my reasons for not continuing on with the book, a lot of you are not going to have the same issues. The things that didn't work for me are not going to be a problem for you. So Notorious Sorcerer follows a young man who is basically an errand boy for a lot of alchemists, and the alchemists, their magic is not necessarily legal, but there is sort of this secret society almost of them that meet together. A lot of them are very well off, and they have this high society feel, so they can kind of get away with it. Our main character, Sion, is somebody who really wants to study alchemy. He is fascinated by it, but he doesn't have the means to be a part of this high society. So he works for them as an errand boy. He goes into these different planes, and I'll get into that in just a second, and then he kind of brings things back to the people that have employed him. And this is so that he can try to earn enough money to eventually become an apprentice to one or kind of work his way in. The opening was fantastic. You immediately jump into it, and sometimes I like a slower build because when you get something kind of action-packed right away, you don't know the characters well enough to really care all that much about what's happening, and so that kind of takes away the stakes. But I actually found the beginning really fascinating. We have this character going into one of these other planes, and you see a lot happening. You see this angel-like being, and it comes after him. You don't really know what's going on, but you're like, whoa, what was that? And then he comes back, and then things start to kind of get rolling. You get some explanation to things. You start to follow Sion as well as some other characters that are introduced. And there's a lot of hints to the world building, and I should say the world itself being very detailed, and there's a lot to the culture. There's a lot to different status, and in the past, different wars that have happened that sort of establish who's who is somebody that has more wealth in society or more respect in society. So you're getting all these hints very quickly. And I was very invested. I was really excited. I thought it seemed so cool. You figure out pretty quickly as well that there seems to be something out of alignment with the planes. So the alchemy has to do with different things taken from different planes. And when I saw it announced and I was looking into it, I thought this reminds me a little bit of V.E. Schwab, A Darker Shade of Magic. And so I think in that way, those sort of different planes, that is where those parallels were. But I found for myself, while I was really intrigued by the hints I was getting about the world, I also felt like the book was moving at such a fast pace that I wasn't able to fully take in all of the details. I think the author clearly has thought through this world, and it seems so interesting, but I wasn't really able to determine everything as well as I would have liked, so that if you see characters interacting and somebody clearly is of a higher status than, let's say, Sion, because he is not of a high status, I can't really appreciate the nuances in their conversation because I'm still trying to pinpoint, okay, well, this group of people, is this like a race of people, or is this just a name for people that are from this area, or is this a name for people that are of a certain status, and like how do they know that for sure? And so there's a lot of details that I could tell the author has thought through, but the way the book was paced, because it was so fast, I just felt like I wasn't able to bring it all in. I'm sure a lot of you in hearing about it are like, that actually sounds really cool, and you won't mind that it's paced really quickly, and you don't maybe probably need to feel like, oh, I understand everything now, so therefore I can't appreciate all these other things. You might not feel like you need all of that. You might be more invested in the plot. Switching now to Ruination. In this story, we follow a woman named Callista. Callista finds that she is most comfortable serving in the military with all of her men and women that serve under her. She is of noble birth, but she wants nothing to do with politics. The king is actually her uncle, and he is a rather untested king, and he wasn't really next in line for the throne. He wasn't thinking he would be the next ruler, so he feels this need to prove himself. And Callista is actually really similar in age to him, so they're more like siblings than niece and uncle. They are very, very close, but Viego, the king, he is so determined to do everything he can to uphold his father's legacy. His father was known as being this lion on the battlefield with politics. He knew how to put everyone in their place and get what he wanted, and he was feared and respected. And Viego wants to follow that, but he is kind of a fish out of water. He doesn't really know how to do that, and so he just forces things, and it's not really working. The only thing that is really holding him in check is his bride Isolde, and she is somebody who actually came from a land that was conquered by their kingdom, and so she has a lot of views that a lot of his advisors wouldn't have. And Isolde is somebody who is guiding him and making him liked by the people a lot more. But then something happens that puts Isolde in danger, and her life is at risk. And to try and cure her, Callista is assigned this mission to try and find these mythical islands that nobody really believes are real. They're called the Blessed Isles, and it is there that she might be able to find something to cure Isolde. I was a little nervous jumping into this because it is a League of Legends story, and if you don't know, League of Legends is what the show Arcane falls into. I loved Arcane. I think most of you know that. I love Arcane so much. It is one of the greatest shows of all time. And so I was a little nervous when I saw there was going to be a novel that it's not based off of anything in Arcane, but it does take place in the same world. I was nervous because I was thinking, oh, I hope that this can deliver. And I'm not necessarily expecting it to be Arcane level because Arcane is a masterpiece and it's also a visual medium. It's very different. It's over the course of a whole season. So I wasn't expecting it to be the same. And I would say I definitely like the show Arcane more than this book. And this is not necessarily a new favorite of all time, but for a fantasy standalone where the author had to try and still write things within the lore that's already established, there's already a world, so they have to basically give this backstory to these characters, which maybe to some people seems like that makes things easier because they don't have to come up with everything themselves. But I think it can actually be challenging for an author to have these limits on their imagination. They have to fit things that will satisfy people who know the lore, but then will also be compelling to people who aren't familiar with this world. And I think that they did that. I actually quite enjoyed this. Again, it's not a new favorite. I think it moves rather quick. It's rather self-contained. And I thought it was a good time. I thought it was fun. I liked the relationships between the characters. If you are going to pick this up, I would say be mindful of the fact that there is lore already established. You probably don't want to look up these characters because it might reveal some things. However, I was excited after I read this because then I wanted to know more about them. I'm like, okay, I'm going to look up this character and I want to see, because of course there's going to be artwork and things, right? Because of the video game and things like that. So I had a good time with it. I think if you're looking for a fun adult fantasy standalone, from beginning to end, I think it felt very complete. If you're looking for something like that, maybe break up some of the really intense big series or the epic stories or the stories that are really demanding of your attention. Basically, if you want to watch a fantasy movie, but read it and have it be, in book form, that's this. Next up, we have The Ballad of Never After. This is a sequel to Once Upon a Broken Heart. This takes place in the same world as Stephanie Garber's Caraval series, and I think because I have read all of that series at this point, and then I really liked the first book in this series, I like this series significantly more than Caraval. I do think that there's still a lot of the same whimsical feel and the same kind of bizarre fairy tale type of magic present, but this one, I just find that the way Stephanie Garber takes tropes that are established and then just has so much fun with them and leans into them and embraces them, I think is a lot of fun. I will say, it is an absolutely ridiculous story. It is one nonsensical thing after the next, but I think that they're really fun, and I think that it does a good job of feeling like a fairy tale, because sometimes you hear about fairy tales and you're like, then this character did this, and then they went off to here, and this thing happened, and you're like, what? And that's sort of the feeling I get while reading this, and I enjoyed it. I really liked the progression of the relationship between the characters. I can't really say too much because it is a sequel, but what I can say is, for those of you who have read it or are about to read it, the ending, I was like, all right, that was pretty clever, but also, come on now. Stephanie Garber's been very secretive about whether or not there's going to be an additional book after this one, and I want to respect that, so I'm not going to say whether I think there will be or there will not be, but I do really want to emphasize how much that ending, I was like, all right, really? So there's something very clever with the way that it ends. And I know this doesn't mean anything to anyone if you haven't picked it up, but if you have picked it up, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I just had such a good time. I was like, oh my gosh, and it was fun. It was fun. Next up, we have the book Belladonna. As I said at the beginning, this is one that I've already done an in-depth book review for. One thing that has nothing to do with the plot, but I actually got questions about, so I want to answer really quick, is what is this edition? So this was the first printing. I can't stand this cover. So it's what it looks like without its sleeve. I believe if you get the Barnes & Noble exclusive, it looks very similar, except for it's a really deep, beautiful purple color. So just wanted to answer that really quick. However, getting into the plot now, Belladonna follows a young woman named Signa. And Signa is discovering that she cannot die. She should have died when she was a baby. Her mother died. A lot of people that her family knew died. And so now she has kind of gone from one parental figure to the next. And they have not always treated her very well. And she's not always recognized that she's not being treated well because she's never really known anything else. And so she actually has a very tragic, sad life for a long time. And she's feeling very isolated and very lonely. The reason so many people are so eager to be parental figures to her is because her family was very wealthy. So nobody ever really seems to care about her for her. There was one parental figure who did, but it almost seems like she's cursed because everybody that comes to care for her, and by that I don't necessarily mean like emotionally, but as a guardian, everybody seems to always end up dying. So at this point, she is very angry with death. Death is personified in the story. She hates death, and she doesn't understand why she's always the one left living. And there is one opportunity then after another figure has died for her to go move in with different family members. But the woman of the family has recently died, and the daughter of that family is now sick, and our character's like, wow, people are dying before I even get there now. I guess this is just the curse I have to live with. And then there's sort of a maybe someone murdered someone, or maybe someone is trying to murder someone, whodunit type of story. And so the plot moves very quickly. And I found I was always really curious about every new person introduced because it has that murder mystery feel, and you're trying to identify what one person's motives might be. And on top of that, though, there was depth in the fact that it tackles grief to be the person left living when so many people that you care for have died. I think there were very subtle, small moments throughout the story, but they were very powerful in how they handled that. And then just in general, I described it as almost being like Phantom of the Opera romance, kind of, sort of, in the story. It's a subplot. It's not the main plot. It's not the main thing pushing the plot forward. But there is that sort of, am I feeling the right thing about this situation right now? This is what it feels like. But maybe that's not what's happening. I think this is what's happening. It's one of those sorts of relationships, kind of like how the Phantom and Christine are. Either way, I thought this book was simultaneously very fast-paced in that I always wanted to turn the page. It was always very intriguing to me while also having more depth than I was expecting. It's not that I think you can't have depth in a murder mystery type of story. I just wasn't really expecting it in this. It is also quite dark, both in some of the things that happen and also I described it as an aesthetic. The aesthetic feels very dark, so it's kind of a gothic fantasy. And it's also a little bit horror inspired as well. So I think it's absolutely the perfect thing to pick up in October, especially if you're somebody who is generally very pathetic like myself when it comes to scary things. And so you don't really want to be really, really scared, but you still want the spooky feeling. I think this will fit that really well. Last for today, we have The Dragon's Promise. This is the sequel to Six Crimson Cranes. And first, I want to say that the premise or the direction I thought that this book's plot was going to go was not necessarily the main focus of the story, or I should say the main setting of the story. Because it's a sequel, I don't want to reveal too much, but I also want people to go in with I don't want people to go in with certain expectations and then be disappointed. So I'll just say that we do end up traveling around in this story, and we go to multiple different places, and we don't necessarily stay in one place. I actually found that this story, I wouldn't say that the surface level plot is actually the main plot. I think this story was very much about the main character's journey for herself. It was for overcoming some loss, learning how to grieve, learning how to become an adult, trying to navigate this almost loss of innocence, and then trying to progress past that. In some ways, I'm not saying that the plot at all is like Six of Crows, but you know how when Six of Crows, when it was first becoming such a big deal, everybody would talk about how it's this heist story and you have these characters that come together to accomplish this impossible task. And so sometimes people would go into it being like, this book is kind of boring because it's so much like a character study. And the heist is just, again, like this, the thing that keeps the plot going. But we really take the time to reflect on things and how the character feels and what they want and all those sorts of things. And so I actually think this one is, I liked it, but I can see a lot of people who liked how fun and adventurous and plot-driven the first book was. The first one, I think, combined plot and character growth really well. This one, I think the plot was fine, but it was the character growth that I think I cared about more. And I think people are going to miss the plot aspects in this sequel. So maybe you'll go into it. Maybe now you're actually more excited to pick this one up because you're like, oh, I don't really care that much about plot. And then maybe some of you are like, nah, darn it. I don't know. But I still did enjoy it. I like the writing style. This is, I would say, leaning more on the young side of young adult. Belladonna, that I was just talking about, I would say leans higher end of young adult. Maybe even if there was a formal new adult age range, maybe in there. This definitely feels like younger end of young adult, kind of coming out of middle grade. It just has a sweetness to it that I want there to be some kind of Disney movie of some sort, or Pixar, or something animated for this, because I think it would just be delightful and heartwarming, and it's the kind of thing that a certain age of kid is going to enjoy, but maybe some adults can enjoy it too. I think it's really sweet and lovely, but I can also see where some people might end up being disappointed in the plot feeling a little meandering. That's it for some new fantasy books. If you have read any of these, feel free to let me know your thoughts on them. If you are interested in hearing more about some other new fantasy books, I will link some recent other wrap-ups I've done, as well as the review for Belladonna, and then the upcoming review for Ruination. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.